Hello and welcome to Chapter 3 for AP Economics Structured Independent Study. In this third foundational chapter entitled The Battle of Philosophies, we're going to change our focus a bit and take a look at the different types of economic systems that are available for a society to choose from and what the ideas are behind them. The concepts presented in this chapter will help you set a foundation of understanding that you'll be able to use when we get into the mechanics of how economic systems work in chapters 5 through 20. So let's begin. Our agenda for this chapter is very straightforward. The first thing we're going to do is define what an economic system is for you. Then we're going to start talking about how they work, what types there are, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each, and then we'll give you a simple list of goals for any economic system. So let's start at the top of that agenda and take on two things here. What are economic systems? We'll define what they are for you and start to look at how they work. Let's start with defining the term economic system and even go a step further and break it down to its component parts, and we'll start with the word system. What is a system? A system is a way of doing something. Now let's take on what an economic system is. Most times I get a response, it's a way of doing something economically. Well, it's actually a little bit more involved than that. It's a method, a way of doing something used by a society to produce and distribute goods and services. And the next point I'm going to make is a very, very important one for you to remember, that a society cannot exist without an economic system. Next, we want to take a look at the role that the economic system plays among the three humanistic systems that can be used by a society. And coming off the last point that I made about a society must have an economic system, it's important to note that a society can function without two of the three humanistic systems. The one that it cannot function without is an economic system. I think you'll find this interesting when you take a look at what the other two humanistic systems are, but they are not a requirement for a society to function. So, the most fundamental humanistic system is the economic system, because it's through the economic system, it's how we survive, it's how we make decisions, it's how we utilize resources and find resources to survive. It's how we distribute goods and services, and effectively how we trade. The next humanistic system is the social system. Social systems are what we value. It involves our culture, our languages, our religions, and our family structures. The third humanistic system is the government system. And government systems are the philosophies that we live by. It involves our social contracts, or our constitutions, our laws, our policies, and the institutions that we set up to help us with our society. There have been societies that have functioned without government systems and without social systems. But want to reemphasize the point here. No society can survive or function without an economic system. In selecting an economic system, a society must answer four fundamental questions. The first is, what goods and services does the society want produced? The second is, how should the goods and services be produced? The third, who should get to be able to consume what type and how much of the goods and services that wind up getting produced? And the fourth is, Who should make the decisions with regard to these first three questions? Let's take a look at each one of these questions in a little bit more depth to make sure you understand what we're looking to get answered here. In answering the question, producing what goods and services, this list could be quite a long one, but I'm going to summarize it into some broad categories and use some of the concepts that we've looked at in chapters 1 and 2. When we say produce what goods and services, we mean, should the society concentrate on consumer goods? Should it concentrate on capital and industrial goods? And as we saw in chapter 2, those can have significant ramifications on a society's development. Should we choose to produce defense-type goods, education, public health, or even welfare-oriented goods? As I said, this list could be quite long, but these are significant decisions. In answering the question, how should the goods and services be produced, the real important part of this is with what resources. Stop and think about this for a second. Let's just look at it from an energy standpoint. Should we produce the goods and services using oil, electric, solar, nuclear, coal, or wind technologies? These are significant choices to make and can have an effect, a dramatic effect, on the society's well-being. In answering the question, who gets to consume and in what form of the goods and services, there are two important parts to understanding this question. Does the market, open market, or the government control how the society distributes the goods and services to be consumed? And who, the government or the open market, controls how the society will distribute income? And in the study of economics, we define income as factor payments. And I think you'd find this logical based upon what we talked about in Chapter 1 with the factors of production. Labor is a factor of production that gets paid and rewarded for its contribution, and that's where the connection in the use of the word factor payments in the definition for income comes from. With regard to the last question for the society to answer, who should make the decisions with regard to the first three questions, there are really three options. Here's the first. Should the society leave it up to the open market, meaning the consumers, to answer those first three questions? Or should it be some mix of the consumers and the government sharing in making the decisions regarding those questions? Or, the third option, should the government make all the decisions with regard to those first three economic questions? In answering those four questions, the society must also remember one additional thing, that all economic systems also require the factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Having now given you the fundamental concept behind an economic system, it's time to move on to telling you about the types of economic systems. There are four types of economic systems for a society to choose from. The first is called a barter economy. In a barter economic system, or a barter economy, direct exchange of one good for another is made without using money. And there are three general characteristics to a barter economy. The first is that a barter system is an ancient system, and it has no advantages in a modern world. And you'd find barter economies in most underdeveloped third world countries. If you're not familiar with the word underdeveloped as it's used here, it means industrially or economically backward or primitive. Here it is used in another sentence. A lack of investment will cause a company or a country to be underdeveloped. The second characteristic of a barter economy is that it's very difficult to set values for the goods and services that are traded. And this makes it very difficult to exchange the goods and services, and it really slows business down. And because of that, it brings up the third characteristic of the barter economy. As a result of having slower transactions and not being able to determine true values or comparative values between goods and services, it slows down innovation in society, and when you slow down innovation, you slow down growth. If you're not familiar with the word innovation, it means something newly introduced, an invention or change. Used in another sentence, Apple's iPad was considered a great innovation. The second type of economic system is called capitalism. It also has another name. You'll hear it referred to quite often as a free market economy. Under capitalism, it's an uncontrolled price-based system that uses money. And in this system, the private consumers make the decisions regarding production and consumption. The third type of economic system is socialism. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as a mixed economy. And here's how socialism works. It's a partially controlled, price-based system that also uses money, but here major production and consumption decisions are shared between the government and consumers in the market. The fourth type of economic system is known as communism. It too goes by another name. You'll hear it referred to as a centrally planned economy at times. This is a system that uses controlled prices. And it does use money, but all production and consumption decisions are made by the government. The consumers in the market are not involved at all. Now from here, we're going to take a look at where the ideas behind each one of these economic systems, where they came from, with the exception of a barter economy. As I mentioned a few moments ago, barter economies are not found or are not really an option to be able to use by a modern society. Modern societies really only have the three options of capitalism, socialism, and communism. So we're going to take a look at where those ideas came from. The ideas behind capitalism, socialism, and communism came from these three individuals. Now, it's very common that most people guess that the individual on the left and in the middle are one of our founding fathers of the United States, and that's not true. However, the individual on the left had a significant impact on the ideas and thinking of the founding fathers. So here's who these three people are. Adam Smith came up with the ideas behind capitalism. Jeremy Bentham came up with the ideas behind socialism, and it was Karl Marx who developed the concepts around communism. And we're going to take a closer look at these three philosophies. The first thing that I want to do is put into context of our study when these individuals came up with their ideas. Adam Smith came up with the concepts behind capitalism in the mid to late 1700s, which is why I had mentioned a moment ago he had a tremendous impact on the thinking of the founding fathers of the United States, and we're going to examine that a little bit closer as we move forward in this chapter. Jeremy Bentham came up with the ideas behind socialism in the early 1800s, and Karl Marx came up with the concepts behind communism in the mid-1800s. Both the concepts that Bentham had and Marx had for socialism and communism came out of the experiences of the Industrial Revolution, which took root in Europe and in the United States during the century of the 1800s. Now, these concepts were further promoted over time, or in another way to say this, each one of these individuals had a number of disciples that continued to promote their philosophies over time up to this present day, and these individuals are going to play a significant role in our study of economics. For capitalism, in the late 1800s, the chief disciple for Adam Smith's ideas was a gentleman by the name of Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises is considered the founder of the Austrian School of Economics, which is rooted in capitalism. And for you students, I recommend that you go to the class website, and in the supplemental video category, there's an introductory video that explains the philosophies and concepts behind the Austrian School of Economics. A disciple of von Mises was Friedrich Hayek, who promoted the ideas of capitalism in the early 1900s. And then a disciple of both Mises and Hayek was Milton Friedman, who just recently passed away, is the most prominent capitalist philosopher of the late 1900s, was the chairman of the School of Economics at the University of Chicago, which is one of the best universities in the United States and is considered a bastion of capitalist thought. In regard to socialism, probably the chief, most prominent disciple of Bentham's ideas, especially in the early 1900s, was John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes also holds the distinction of being the so-called father of the study of macroeconomics and will play a significant role in our study in the second semester this year. And communism was promoted from a discipleship standpoint, Marx's ideas, by Lenin, who led the communist Bolshevik revolution in Russia in the early 1900s, which had a profound impact across the entire world as many countries turned towards using a communist economic system. Now, two important considerations with regard to these economic philosophies that sit behind the choices of economic systems. The first is that no pure economic system exists. Elements of all four, and I'm including the barter system here, exist in each other. Also, passionate debates have erupted over each of these systems and comparing one to another over the past couple of centuries. Now, if you're not familiar with the word passionate, we mean intense feelings showing expressing strong emotions. Used in another sentence, you could see that she was passionate about the subject. So passionate debate over these philosophies is rooted in arguments about the same fundamental beliefs that are behind or have fueled the debates over what type of governmental philosophy and systems should be put in place for a society. And these philosophies, or the debates over the philosophies at the root level, have involved the nature of man. Meaning, people debate about whether man is fundamentally evil or good, motivated or lazy, and whether man needs to be controlled or is able to be or able to manage himself. Since the passionate debates over economic and governmental systems and philosophies are rooted in the same concepts. In an effort to further deepen students' understanding of these debates, we have put together a comparison of the characteristics of the two philosophies and where they match up. Let's take a look first at democracy, which is usually most often paired up with capitalism. Some of the characteristics. Under a democratic governmental philosophy, as well as capitalist economic philosophy, it's generally accepted that man is good and that man is self-motivated, and that a society's best interests are best served when man is free. Now that's one end of the spectrum of philosophy here. Let's go to the extreme other end, or the completely contrasting point of view, which happens to be communism, which most commonly, from a governmental system standpoint, is matched up with a totalitarian governmental system or a monarchy. The general philosophy here, both from a governmental philosophy point of view and an economic, is that man is inherently evil, that man is lazy, and a society's best interests are best served when man is controlled by an authority. Now, in between this is a limited democracy approach, which is usually paired up with a socialist economic philosophy. In this case, and notice the subtle differences here between the two extremes, man is considered good, but man is considered not to be able to help himself. And therefore, society must be helped by an authority. Now let's take a look at these three major economic philosophies in greater depth, and we'll start with capitalism. And by the way, capitalism is fundamentally the economic system and philosophy that the United States is based upon. And speaking of that, Adam Smith taught us about capitalism in a book that he wrote and published called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And I say, by the way, you'll notice the date is the same date that the United States as a country was created. And a little bit earlier on in this chapter, I had mentioned that Adam Smith had an influence on the founding fathers of the United States. Adam Smith was talking about the philosophy of capitalism well before this book was published in 1776. And the founding fathers of the United States, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and the like, Ben Franklin as well, were all very well aware of Adam Smith's ideas and concepts. With regard to capitalism, I'd like to mention 6 facts regarding its origin and history in terms of where Smith's ideas came from. First, Adam Smith was inspired by the economic abuses of feudalism and monarchical rule. If you recall back to your world history class, during the Middle Ages, societies were fairly oppressive and ruled over with an iron fist by monarchs. Capitalism is also the economic part, or economic philosophy part, of the Enlightenment philosophies. Voltaire, Rousseau, John Locke, well, they're the most prominent Enlightenment philosophers, but Adam Smith is generally considered the most prominent of the economic philosophers of that Enlightenment period. The third point about its origins and history is that, ironically, capitalism was originally called liberalism because it promoted individual liberties and freedoms. I think you can see the root word liberty in liberalism. And today, capitalism is no longer called liberalism. It's considered a conservative philosophy and actually socialism, and you could extend it as far as communism, uh, sometimes gets applied a liberalism type label, which is kind of ironic because both of those systems actually work towards limiting individual liberties and freedoms. The fourth point with regard to capitalism's origins and history is that most historians would agree that, coupled with the political revolutions that occurred in England, the United States, France, and other places in Europe as a result of the Enlightenment philosophies, it was the promotion of capitalism through Adam Smith's ideas that caused the Industrial Revolution to take place in conjunction with those political revolutions into the 1800s. And it was the period of the Industrial Revolution based upon capitalist philosophy that ushered in the second greatest increase in the global standard of living in the history of the world. The fifth point is that capitalism came under severe attack and actually fell out of favor in the early 1900s, despite having affected such a great increase in the standard of living throughout the world. And when capitalism fell out of favor, it led to economic stagnation and massive losses of individual freedoms around the world. If you're not familiar with the word stagnation as it's used here, it means fail to progress or develop. Related words stifle or static. Used in another sentence, if you do not read or listen to the news, you will stagnate as a citizen. And the sixth point is that, fortunately for all of us living today, capitalism returned to favor over the past 33 years. And the result of that is that it has produced the greatest advancement in global productivity and has raised standards of living to the highest they have ever been in recorded human history throughout the world. And it returned to favor thanks to such people, a couple of who I mentioned before, Friedrich Hayek, noted below in the far left, and Milton Friedman over to the far right, but some additional powerful philosophers and political figures that of our recent times, Ayn Rand, President Ronald Reagan, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain. Capitalism is based upon four fundamental beliefs. First is that people have an innate desire to better their position in life. That relates to that point I made a few moments ago about being that man is self-motivated. Two, people respond to incentives of all type, positive and negative. Three, that by pursuing one's own interests, individual interests, the individual will help society far more effectively than when he or the government focuses on trying to help the society. The fourth belief underpinning Adam Smith's capitalist philosophy is a little bit abstract, so I want you to pay attention closely and think about this, and I believe it'll make a lot of sense to you. Adam Smith said that the invisible hand would have to exist to guide the capitalist system. And what he termed as the invisible hand is a combination of three factors that must exist and work together for the system. Here's the first of the three factors that must exist. An environment must exist that promotes self-interest and personal gain in the form of people being able to make a profit. And profit is defined a little bit differently here than we did in Chapter 2, where we looked at it more from a numerical and business measurement standpoint. Philosophically, profit is defined as the financial gain made in a transaction, meaning the exchange, of goods or services. The second condition that Adam Smith said needed to exist for the invisible hand to be effective in guiding the capitalist economic system is the existence of incentive, meaning that the hope of reward or fear of punishment, both positive and negative here, that would wind up encouraging stable behavior on the part of human beings. The third part of the invisible hand or condition that needed to exist, according to Adam Smith, was that competition must also need to exist, free competition. And competition has been defined as the struggle among producers of goods and services for the dollars of consumers. And many times you'll hear that the concept of competition be referred to as the regulator, in the natural regulator, that is, of a market. Adam Smith's philosophy of capitalism has 5 characteristics to it. The first is that it encourages freedom, individual rights that are based on the rule of law, and it supports democratic governmental systems. Now please notice that I have the rule of law highlighted here in blue. It's to remind me to remind you or tell you that you should be sure to check out the supplemental video on the Through the Class website that for Chapter 3 that is on the Rule of Law by the Liberty Foundation. So please make sure you do that to get a thorough understanding of what we mean by the rule of law. The second characteristic for capitalism is that it believes in private ownership of goods, property, businesses, and the factors of production for a society. The third characteristic is that it also believes in the voluntary exchanges, not the forced exchange, but the voluntary exchanges of money, goods, and services. A fourth characteristic of the capitalist system is that it encourages competition among producers, and it will reward the producers for delivery of value in what they produce. We'll look closer at the concept of what value means in Chapter 5 coming up. The sixth characteristic of the capitalist system is that businesses and consumers collectively make the decisions about what to produce for the society, how to produce it, and who gets to consume it. Adam Smith said a policy of laissez-faire, that's a French term, should be followed. And what that means is limited government intervention in the economic system. The literal translation, French translation from French of laissez-faire is hands-off. In looking to examine the capitalist system a little closer, we find that it is made up of 2 fundamental parts that are both under private control, not government control. The first part to think about, or category, are the households. The households are what supply the labor and the capital, meaning the investments, for the system. The other part are the firms or the companies or the businesses in the system. They're organizations that use the resources, labor, factors of production, so forth, to produce the products and services that are sold to the households. Closely related to the 2 fundamental parts of the capitalist system, the households and the firms or businesses, are the 2 fundamental markets within the system. The first category of market is what we call the factor market. And as you might guess from the term, we're referring to the factors of production here. The factor market is where the resources or the factors of production are exchanged and goods and services are produced. Now, typically, the factor market is primarily made up of businesses that are producing things, firms and companies. The other market, fundamental market, is called the product and service market. And this is where the finished goods and services are exchanged in the society. Now, this is primarily the primary participant here is the households in consuming the goods, the finished goods and services. But there are businesses that also participate in the product and service market. A Walmart, as an example. Walmart does not produce anything specifically, meaning manufacture or develop something. Therefore, it's not part of the factor market. It operates exclusively in the product and service market, closely related to the households. And that's why we have this point at the bottom of the slide here that says, just beware that there can be a little bit of overlap between these markets at times. In our study of economics, we've developed an illustration that helps us to better understand the interaction between the factor market and the product and service market. And this illustration is called the circular flow by economists. And what it shows is simply that it's the households that provide the labor and the investment capital for firms to develop the products and services that they do in the factor market. And in return, the firms and companies provide the products, goods, and services back in through the product market to be consumed by households. Let's now take a look at the advantages of the capitalist economic system and philosophy. There are three advantages. The first is that this system produces economic efficiency. And by this, what we mean is only the items that consumers want wind up getting produced. And they get produced when the consumers want them. And they get produced at the prices at what we call the willingness to pay threshold. If you're not familiar with the word threshold as it's used here, it means an entrance or entryway, the verge or the brink. Used in another sentence, in another way, he stood at the threshold of the room. The second advantage of the capitalist economic system and philosophy is economic freedom. And what we mean by this is that workers have the freedom to work where they want. Producers have the freedom to produce what they want. And individuals have the freedom to consume what they want. The third advantage of a capitalist economic system and philosophy is that it promotes economic growth far and above over any of the other choices for economic systems. And that's because under capitalism, competition is encouraged. And it's through competition that innovation occurs. And it's through innovation occurring, it's the only thing that helps a society grow and thrive. And when a society grows and thrives, it raises a society's standard of living. Now, students are recommended here at this point to visit the class website, to go to the supplemental video section for Chapter 3. And there are a series of videos on economic freedom and economic growth that are very important to view, to have a deeper understanding of some of the facts and proofs behind these advantages. So I highly recommend students take the time to take a look at those. Hey, now like any decision made about anything that we've seen through our study in chapters 1 and 2, there are always trade-offs, and the same holds true for deciding about an economic system. So the capitalist philosophy and economic system does have some disadvantages or trade-offs. And there are two fundamental ones. So let's take a look at them now. First, the capitalist system and philosophy does not promote equity. And what we mean by equity is equal treatment from a reward perspective, and also does not spread wealth among the population evenly. If you're not familiar with the word perspective, it means a view or a point of view. Outlook, vista are synonyms. John was asked about his perspective regarding the program. In other words, his view regarding the program. So capitalism does not promote equity, doesn't promote equal treatment from a reward perspective, and therefore does not spread wealth evenly among the population. Second disadvantage, some may say, is that the system encourages exploitation of all resources. Some countries that are based fundamentally on capitalist philosophy, the United States and Great Britain, are great examples of that. Next, we're going to take a look at socialism in the same way that we've just looked at capitalism. Earlier in this chapter, I had mentioned that you may hear socialism referred to as a mixed economy. Yet you may run into a third term as well. Sometimes it'll be called collectivism. The first thing we'll do here is take a look at some of the origins and history behind socialism, and I want to touch on 5 facts related to that. The first is, as you know, socialism was founded by Jeremy Bentham. Second is that, according to supporters of socialism and many historians, it was created in response to a number of things. The first is the societal and political strife in societies that existed under monarchies prior to the Enlightenment period and the political revolutionary period of the late 1700s and early 1800s. The second thing is that it was created in response as an alternative to capitalism, which is labeled by socialists as a form of social Darwinism. You may be familiar with Darwinism from your historical studies as being related to the survival of the fittest. Well, they labeled capitalism as an economic system that's based upon survival of the fittest. The third thing they say that socialism was created in response to was the working conditions of the Industrial Revolution. And I've always found this kind of puzzling, which is why I asked the question why, for a number of reasons. And I'm going to outline them here for you for consideration. Here's the first. I've always had the question of whether working life on a farm and working the land back in the Middle Ages, whether that was less difficult than working in an industrial environment, let's say in a factory. You know, was it any less work from a hard work standpoint, or was it less dangerous on a farm? I find that hard to believe. Life was pretty rough in both cases. Both had its difficulties in terms of the amount and difficulty of the labor, and also the dangers associated with it. So I don't think one was more beneficial over than the other. Second thing was that based upon the revolutions that occurred during the Age of Revolution, late 1700s, early 1800s, and the settling in many societies of the rule of law, that people actually began to have the choice of being able to work either the land, let's say in a farm, or go and work in an industrial environment. And the statistics clearly show by the rise of populations in urban areas and cities and the number of people working in industrial environments that people left the land in droves to work in an industrial environment. So the question I have is, why would they do that if the working conditions generally, both in terms of the difficulty of the work and the potential danger of the work, why would they do that in droves to trade something that would be worse for something that would be better? I'm not quite sure that the arguments made by some historians and socialists pan out with that. Well, the answer to that question is that their standard of living by working in an industrial environment was actually raised, and we have statistical proof of that. As I mentioned earlier, the second greatest increase in the standard of living globally occurred during the Industrial Revolution, and the reason for that is that people were paid more to go work in an industrial environment. So how bad could things be versus what they had. It seems that life was a lot better off working in that industrial environment. So I really question as to whether this was a good reason for socialism developing and flourishing as a concept. Now, socialism did gain favor in the early 1900s throughout the world and wound up coming to dominate two-thirds of the world by the first half of the 1900s. What this resulted in is, and across the globe, productivity declines and economic stagnation, an actual decline in the standard of living globally, and significant losses of individual freedoms, and it then led to social unrest. Socialism finally fell from favor when the radical forms of this philosophy and system, fascism and communism, the extreme forms of socialism, failed in the mid to late 1900s. If you're not familiar with the word radical as it's used here, it means carried to the utmost extreme, revolutionary, rebel, contrary. Her views on the subject were considered to be radical. And a moment ago I had mentioned that socialism wound up limiting freedom for people around the world. It also led to the deaths of many around the world. Here are, especially under the extreme forms of socialism, both fascism and communism. And here's an example of how not only freedoms were limited and people actually lost their lives under such oppressive systems. Let's now take a look at the three beliefs behind socialism. Bentham said that a society should provide for economic equality by ensuring the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, and, most importantly, that individual rights should be sacrificed for a society's rights. The second belief behind socialism is that human nature is basically good, and the majority of people have a real concern for social justice. Bentham's third belief was that if a society worked for the benefit of all members, poverty and injustice would disappear. Now, all the economic systems have been tried multiple times by many societies. And interestingly, when socialism has been tried by the societies, poverty and injustice has not disappeared. It has actually increased. And that would be an interesting conversation to have with Bentham if we could have it. I guess the best explanation as to why this is summed up in a favorite quote of mine from an entertainer that you might know, Bill Cosby, who said, "I may not know the keys to success, but I do know that the key to failure is trying to please everybody." We'll now take a look at four characteristics of socialism. First, at the start, socialism encourages political freedom and the coexistence with democratic forms of government. Its second characteristic is that it allows some private ownership. However, the significant portions of the factors of production, as well as the pricing system, are owned and controlled by the government. The third characteristic of socialism is that the government takes the dominant role in managing the economy through its spending and regulation of individuals and businesses. The fourth characteristic of socialism is that it is inefficient for two reasons. First, because it reduces private ownership, that results in limiting of incentives for people, for individuals and businesses. And when incentive is limited or reduced, it discourages innovation on behalf of individuals and businesses. And when innovation is discouraged or held back, it winds up slowing the growth for the society. Second, high cost of government spending through supporting social programs. Because the government is trying to promote equity and distribute wealth evenly and find the best for all, government spends a lot of money on social programs. And what is a social program? It's a government economic action to encourage a stable society. And that in turn drives up the cost of living, which also slows growth. Let's now take a look at the advantages of socialism. First, socialism does promote greater economic equality through the spreading of wealth. And when wealth is spread, there's less exploitation. From a disadvantage standpoint, socialism clearly limits freedoms, as everybody is made equal. It tends to be very inefficient, and it tends to be very costly and retard or hold back growth. Some countries based upon socialism, I'll offer two: Greece and Spain. And if you had all listened to the news over the past couple of years, you may recognize those countries as having extreme social and economic difficulties, which are directly related to their adoption of the socialist economic system. Let's stop for a minute and consider some food for thought. I have a question for you. Did the United States ever seriously consider implementing a socialist economic system? And the answer to this is yes, many times. There haven't been any successes. There were some certain failures. And we have a situation that we're still working with that's yet to be determined. Let me start and illustrate a couple of the examples. And I'll go back to colonial times. And I'll go way back. I'll actually go back to the Jamestown colony. You may remember from your history lessons that Jamestown set up a unique way to manage resources in the colony. It was called the Common Store System. Well, the Common Store System was effectively a socialist approach to managing resources. Everybody pooled their resources and efforts together to provide for the colony. Now, it so happened that some people worked harder than others and contributed more resources to the Common Store system, while other people didn't work so hard. In fact, some people just kicked back and did nothing and still expected to reap the benefits out of the common resources in the system. What this led to was infighting and disagreements and actually some violence and the abandonment of this socialist approach to managing resources. This concept was tried once again when communes were established at various places in the United States during the early 1800s. For example, the New Harmony commune that was set up in Indiana and the Berkshire Farms commune that was set up in Massachusetts. Here, too, the members of the commune gathered together and contributed resources and efforts in a common store system type of approach, with the same results that was experienced in the Jamestown situation. Some people carried the load, others did not. It led to arguments and disagreements, and eventually the collapse of the communes. More recently, in the early 1900s, Franklin Roosevelt, through his New Deal programs, implemented what some historians and economists would consider another type of socialist approach to managing resources. In this case, it wasn't the pooling of direct resources by members of our society in the United States. It was the government stepping in to either tax and borrow resources to spread the resources across the country in the form of social programs to help people and distribute the wealth and also find a higher level of economic equality for the citizens of the United States. These programs, the new programs, were continued up through actually today in a progression of expanded programs under President Truman, called the Fair Deal under John F. Kennedy, called the New Frontier, and under Lyndon Johnson called the Great Society. The programs that were created during these times are still with us today, which is why I say this approach has yet to be determined as to whether it would be successful in implementing a socialistic approach to distributing wealth and also providing for the greatest happiness for the greatest number. We're running into some problems along these lines, to the point about socialism being, or socialist programs being, somewhat inefficient, in that our national debt is reaching record levels, and we'll see how that winds up getting managed as we go forward. It's time now to move on and take a look at communism. Communism is an extreme form of socialism that puts all economic control in the hands of the government. There's no rule of law as we are familiar with here in the United States. Because communism grew out of socialist movement, we're not going to look at the history and origins of communism. We're going to go directly to the beliefs behind communism. And there are 4 additional socialist beliefs that we add on here. Here's the first. Communism believes that economics is the most powerful force in history, and that a class struggle between employers and the proletariat is a German word for working class, meaning employees, and that the struggle between the employers and the employees will always be unavoidable. A second belief of communists is that capitalism creates prosperity for only a few and poverty for many. If you're not familiar with the word prosperity, it means to be fortunate, successful, or well off, to thrive, to have abundance. If you're a Star Trek fan, you'll remember that Spock said, "Live long and prosper." I find this belief to be very interesting given the historical facts and track record of communism, especially compared to capitalism. In every country that has adopted communism, it has failed miserably and has left the people in poverty and suffering with a very low standard of living. Countries that have adopted capitalism have had the exact opposite experience, and for that matter, capitalism, when broadly accepted and used across the globe, has raised the global standard of living twice to very high levels. A third belief of communists is that the wealthy, meaning the employers, have always owned the factors of production and have not provided or refused to provide economic equality. And the fourth belief of the communists, on top of the fundamental socialist beliefs, is that the workers of the world would do 3 things. They would first unite and create a classless society. They would then overthrow capitalist systems and governments where they were, and many actually did during the period of the early 1900s, most notably in Russia and China. And then the people would establish governments of the people with centrally planned, government-controlled economies. So with the track record of communism not being too good, do any countries use communism today? And the answer to that is yes. We can count them almost on one hand. The 2 most notable are Cuba and North Korea. And if you're at all familiar with those countries that are periodically in the news, the standard of living in those countries is among the lowest in the world, with quite a bit of personal suffering and virtually no freedom for the people. Let's take a look now at the 4 characteristics, fundamental characteristics of communism. First, communism operates in direct contrast to capitalism, and it needs a totalitarian form of government to maintain control. If you're not familiar with the word operates and how it's used here, it means to function effectively or to work. Function, perform as synonyms. Keep your car in good operating condition by changing the oil regularly. The second characteristic is that the central government makes all the decisions regarding any type of production and consumption. Third characteristic is that no private ownership is permitted. None. Government controls all property. It controls the factors of production and strives to evenly spread the wealth. In fact, it does and achieves this objective. Nobody owns anything, so therefore nobody has any wealth. And the fourth characteristic is that communist systems use collectives to keep people employed and busy. Collectives are state-owned farms or factories. And interestingly, here, the communist system tries to utilize one of the most fundamental concepts in economics that we looked at in Chapter 2. Through the collectives, they try to maximize productivity through using division of labor and specialization. Now let's consider the advantages and disadvantages of a communist system. From an advantage standpoint, there's only one. It usually produces good short-term results for the society. The reason for this is as collectives are put in place and the division of labor and specialization is used, it really focuses the society well in the early stages of its implementation, and you usually get some good production based upon that. The disadvantages have caused every attempt at a communist economy to fail. Here's the first. Totalitarian governments, which the communist system needs, and central planning have always fallen victim to a law that we looked at in Chapter 2, the law of increasing costs, as the government must produce guns through the collectives over butter, meaning military, not consumer goods primarily in the factories, to control the society. And this leads to massive inefficiency. This picture that you see here of a supermarket with empty shelves on it is an actual photograph from a food store in the Soviet Union just prior to its collapse in the early 1990s. The second reason is that totalitarian systems, meaning governmental systems, severely limits freedom. And when you limit freedom for people, you wind up with unmotivated workers. And when you have unmotivated workers, you wind up with poor quality products, low productivity, inefficiency, which then leads to shortage and overall little growth in an economy. And over time, what happens is the society fails to sustain growth and begins to rot from the inside. A few moments ago, I had mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union. Let's use the Soviet Union as an example of how the adoption of a communist economic system can lead to the collapse of a society. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world at one point. It politically controlled 2/3 of the world. It was also in the top 3 in natural resources. And it had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 10 times over. However, after 69 years of trying to get communism to work, it collapsed on December 21st, 1991, without, and this is absolutely remarkable, a society collapsed without the loss of a single life or a shot being fired. This is detailed in to great length in a great book by Nathan Sharansky. It's titled "The Case for Democracy." And here's a quote that sums up the reason why this happened to the Soviet Union based upon the experience with communism. A regime based on fear must maintain increasingly tight control over its population to remain in power, and such control inevitably triggers a process of decay. Here's the bottom line with regard to communism. If you're not familiar with the term bottom line, it's a common business term that means net or end result. In the middle of the 1800s, a well-known French writer and philosopher came to the United States to study our society, and particularly our form of government and its matching economic system of capitalism. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville, and he wrote a very famous book, he said, Journey to America. And here's an extract of the book, and what de Tocqueville did was predicted long in advance what the net results of implementation of a socialist system would bring about. Capitalism and democracy extend the sphere of individual freedom. Socialism, says de Tocqueville, restricts it. Capitalism and democracy attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Capitalism and democracy have nothing in common with socialism except, ironically, for one word: equality. But note the difference, and here's the irony. While capitalism and democracy seek equality in liberty and freedom, socialism seeks equality through or in restraint and servitude. Very insightful. Later on in the late 1900s, the champion of capitalism, Milton Friedman, was a little bit more direct with regard to our solemn responsibility as United States citizens. Friedman said the battle for freedom must be won over and over again. Socialists must be won over and over again, and socialists must continually be persuaded or defeated if they and we are to remain free men. Milton Friedman said that we need to keep some very important things in mind. The first is that capitalism can be threatened and debilitated without any violent overthrow of a government. It's done through implementing reckless laws and reckless spending. If you're not familiar with the word debilitated, it means to make feeble or weak, to cripple or disable. Used in another sentence, the army debilitated its enemy by putting them under siege. Friedman also said that anti-capitalist impulses arise out of a lack of education about the role of business in a civil society based on the rule of law. In effect, if you do not have business or you're anti-business, there will be no wealth to redistribute at all. Friedman also reminded us that businesses are not antisocial. In a healthy culture, they will be creating over 90% of the jobs for a society. Now let's take a look at goals for any economic system. There are 5 goals for an economic system. The first is that an economic system should look to be efficient. In other words, maximize the resources available to the society. Secondly, or a second goal, the economic system should promote economic freedom. Freedom from government intervention in the production and distribution of goods and services. If you're not familiar with the word intervention, it means to come between so as to hinder, modify, or restrict, interfere, or divide. The police officer intervened to stop the fight. A third goal for economic systems is to make sure that security and predictability are offered to the society. In both reward and punishment for performance. A fourth goal is to promote equity, but not equality. Equity meaning equal opportunity and treatment for all people within the society. And the fifth goal of an economic system should be to promote growth and innovation, because that is the only way to boost the overall standard of living in any society. So in conclusion here to Chapter 3, we ask the question, which system do you want to live under? And I think the answer is pretty clear. It's capitalism, of course. Now, as we wrap up Chapter 3 here, I want to recommend to students that there is a wealth of supplemental videos on the class website that we strongly recommend and urge them to view. Provides good comparisons between capitalism and socialism, goes into depth about how capitalism works and provides examples. And we really recommend that students make themselves available to review those videos. Thank you for your time with Chapter 3, and we'll see you again as we move on to Chapter 4 and take a look at the American version customized version of capitalism.